close your eyes and let me take you back 4,000 years to the banks of the Nile, where the most horrifying preservation process known to humanity was being perfected in ways that would shock modern scientists. You think you know about Egyptian mummification? Think again. Tonight, we're peeling back the linen wrappings to reveal secrets so disturbing that most documentaries won't even mention them. From brain extraction while victims were still conscious, to the use of living prisoners as practice subjects, to ritual cannibalism hidden within sacred ceremonies. This isn't the sanitized version you learned in school. This is the real, unfiltered truth about why ancient Egyptians were so obsessed with preserving the dead that they created techniques more horrifying than anything modern torture could devise. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to discover why Egyptian mummification was humanity's most terrifying obsession. But don't worry. We'll explore these dark secrets in the most soothing way possible, letting these ancient mysteries carry you into peaceful sleep. Picture the year 3400 BCE in the scorching sands of prehistoric Egypt. A grieving family has just buried their loved one in the traditional way, a simple grave in the desert sand. But when they return months later to honor the dead, they discover something that will haunt human civilization for millennia. The body hasn't decomposed. Instead, the hot, dry sand has naturally preserved the corpse in a way that seems almost supernatural. The skin, though darkened, remains intact. The features are still recognizable. It's as if death itself has been cheated. But this accidental preservation came with a horrifying realization. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed a physical body to survive in the afterlife. Without preservation, the soul would be trapped forever in a limbo worse than death itself. This belief would drive them to develop techniques so extreme that they bordered on the psychotic. Let me introduce you to Ankef and Sekhmet, a master embalmer working in Memphis around 2500 BCE. His workshop, discovered by archaeologists in 1995, revealed tools and techniques that would make a medieval torture chamber look like a children's playground. Ankef en Sekhmet's records, written on papyrus and hidden for centuries, describe the evolution of mummification from simple preservation to something far more sinister. The early embalmers quickly realized that natural mummification was bodies would sometimes arrive at the afterlife incomplete, missing limbs or vital organs that had rotted away. This led to the first intentional interventions, cutting open the recently deceased to speed the drying process. But as Ankef and Sekhmet's journal reveals, there were complications. The spirits of the dead, he claimed, would sometimes become angry during the process, requiring special rituals to keep them calm. The ancient Egyptian obsession with death wasn't just religious, it was pathological. Archaeological evidence suggests that wealthy families would sometimes begin the mummification process before their relatives were actually dead, convinced that starting early would guarantee better preservation. Consider the case of Kentkawes, a minor noble whose mummy was discovered in 1923. Medical examination revealed that she had been embalmed while still alive, her organs removed and replaced with preservation salts while her heart was still beating. The embalmers had somehow convinced her family that this living mummification would ensure her place in the afterlife. But the psychological horror goes deeper. Papyrus records from the Temple of Ptah describe practice mummifications performed on condemned criminals and slaves. These living subjects were used to perfect techniques, their screams muffled by linen wrappings as embalmers learned exactly how much natron salt a living body could endure before death. The records, written in hieroglyphic code that wasn't decoded until 1987, reveal that embalmers believed the suffering of the practice subjects somehow transferred protective powers to the mummies of the wealthy. Each scream, each moment of agony, was thought to strengthen the death magic that would preserve the pharaohs for eternity. Ankef and Sekhmet's most disturbing entry describes a technique called the awakening cut, an incision made in the abdomen while the subject was still alive, designed to begin preservation while the soul was still present in the body. The embalmer believed this created a stronger connection between the physical form and the spirit, ensuring they would remain united in death. The sacred cannibalism. Hidden in rituals. 25 Yaowan 35. Perhaps the most shocking discovery in modern Egyptology came in 1994, when researchers analyzing mummy wrappings found traces of human flesh that didn't belong to the mummified individual. Further investigation revealed evidence of what can only be described as ritualistic cannibalism integrated into the mummification process. The practice, mentioned obliquely in religious texts but never explicitly described, involved the consumption of small amounts of flesh from the deceased by the embalmers. This wasn't random barbarism. It was a carefully planned ritual designed to transfer the deceased's life force to those preparing the body for eternity. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's groundbreaking 2018 study of mummy preparation chambers uncovered grinding stones specifically designed for human tissue, along with ceremonial cups that tested positive for human DNA. The embalmers weren't just preserving the dead, though, they were incorporating parts of them into their own bodies as part of the sacred process. The ritual texts describe this as becoming one with the eternal flesh, a process that supposedly gave embalmers the ability to communicate with the spirits of the dead during preservation. But the psychological toll was enormous. Many embalmers developed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe PTSD, documented in medical papyri as the curse of the flesh-eaters. Even more disturbing is evidence that family members of the deceased were sometimes required to participate in these consumption rituals. Tooth marks found on certain bones suggest that mourning relatives bit directly into the flesh of their loved ones, believing this would maintain their connection beyond death. This practice continued in secret long after official Egypt became Christianized, with hidden mummification cults operating as late as 400 CE. The last known evidence comes from a monastery in Upper Egypt, where monks were apparently practicing modified versions of these ancient flesh rituals, in the belief that they were honoring early Christian martyrs. Not every mummification was successful, and the failures were more horrifying than the successes. Archaeological evidence reveals that some individuals were accidentally mummified while still alive, their final moments preserved forever in twisted facial expressions of absolute terror. The mummy of Usermontu, discovered in 1881, shows clear signs of having been conscious during the early stages of preservation. His fingers are clawed, as if trying to tear through the wrappings, and his mouth is open in what researchers describe as an eternal scream. Chemical analysis of his tissue shows that he lived for several days after the preservation process began. Even more disturbing are the moving mummies, preserved bodies that seem to shift position over time. Modern analysis suggests that some individuals were preserved while in a coma or death-like state, only to partially revive during the wrapping process. Their struggles to escape created air pockets and tension in the linen that continues to cause movement centuries later. The tomb of Ankhesenamun contains multiple mummies that appear to have been buried alive, their preservation beginning before death was complete. These half-dead mummies became objects of terror even to ancient Egyptians, who developed special rituals to keep them from rising and seeking revenge. Perhaps most chilling are the children's mummies that show signs of conscious preservation. Tiny handprints pressed into the inner wrappings, bite marks on the linen, evidence that young victims tried desperately to escape their linen prisons. These discoveries have forced archaeologists to confront the possibility that child sacrifice was more common in Egyptian mummification than previously believed. The practice of living mummification wasn't always accidental. Religious texts describe it as the ultimate honor, to be preserved while the soul was still present, ensuring the strongest possible connection to the afterlife. Volunteers, usually elderly priests or devoted servants, would submit to gradual preservation over weeks or months, their consciousness fading as their bodies were slowly transformed into eternal vessels. As we leave this dark chapter of Egyptian preservation practices, let your mind drift away from these ancient horrors. Focus on your breathing, on the comfort of your bed, on the safety of the modern world. But remember, what we've just explored was only the beginning of the mummification story. Welcome to the Ibu, the purification house where the real horror of mummification began. Far from the sterile procedures you might imagine, these workshops were slaughterhouses where the line between preservation and torture disappeared entirely. Let me walk you through the experience of Amenhotep, a scribe whose mummification process was documented in unprecedented detail by his chief embalmer, Katie. The papyrus record, discovered in 1934 but kept classified until 1987, reveals exactly what happened to a body during the 70-day mummification process. Day 1 begins just hours after death, while the body is still warm. Amenhotep is carried into a stone chamber lined with drainage channels, because what's about to happen will produce substantial amounts of fluid. The embalmers, wearing protective amulets and chanting protective spells, begin with what they call the opening of the mouth ceremony. But this isn't the symbolic ritual you might have read about. Using a copper blade, they literally force open the jaw and begin the first extraction, the tongue. Ancient Egyptians believed the tongue contained too much moisture to preserve properly, so it had to be removed while the throat muscles were still flexible. The brain extraction comes next, and here's where the horror truly begins. The traditional story tells us embalmers used a hooked tool inserted through the nose to pull out brain matter. The reality was far more brutal and sophisticated. Katie's records describe a process called the awakening of the skull. A heated bronze rod was inserted through the nasal cavity to literally cook the brain, liquefying it for easier removal. But here's the terrifying part. This was sometimes done while the person was still unconscious but alive, as embalmers believed consciousness was necessary to guide the soul during preservation. The smell, according to Katie, was like burning fish mixed with honey. A scent so distinctive that embalmers could tell from across the workshop when the brain was ready for extraction. The liquefied brain matter was then sucked out through reed tubes, a process that could take hours and often resulted in facial collapse that had to be corrected with padding. But not all the brain was removed. Egyptian texts refer to the seed of memory, a small portion of brain tissue that was deliberately left behind, usually in the area we now know controls long-term memory. Embalmers believed this fragment would help the deceased remember their earthly life in the afterlife. The abdominal incision was made with obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical instruments. But the cutting was only the beginning of the nightmare. Katie's detailed descriptions reveal that organ removal was a carefully choreographed dance of death. that could take an entire day to complete. The liver came out first, often still warm and sometimes still functioning. Egyptian embalmers had discovered that the liver could continue to process toxins for several hours after death, so they would massage and manipulate it to extract as much fluid as possible before preservation. The stomach presented special challenges. If the deceased had eaten recently, the stomach contents had to be carefully removed and examined. Why? Because ancient Egyptians believed that a person's last meal could predict their fate in the afterlife. Certain foods found in the stomach required special protective rituals to prevent the deceased from experiencing eternal hunger. But the most horrifying discovery was what embalmers did with the intestines. These weren't simply removed. They were unraveled, section by section, while embalmers searched for what they called the worms of corruption. These parasites, common in ancient Egypt, were believed to be demons that would continue to feed on the soul in the afterlife unless they were manually extracted. The intestinal cleaning process could take 6 to 8 hours. Each section was scraped clean with copper tools, then washed in palm wine and natron solution. Embalmers kept detailed records of every parasite found, as the number and type supposedly predicted how difficult the deceased's journey to the afterlife would be. The heart, sacred above all organs, was left in place, but not untouched. Using thin copper probes, embalmers would puncture the heart muscle and drain it of blood, then refill it with a mixture of natron, tree resin, and ground precious stones. This sacred stuffing was supposed to give the heart the strength to pass the judgment of the gods. Now comes the part that turned human beings into leather. Natron salt, mined from dried lake beds, was the key to preservation, and the source of unimaginable suffering for any who were still alive during treatment. Amenhotep's body is completely packed with natron salt, inside the chest cavity, stuffed into the skull through the nose, packed around the limbs. But this isn't gentle preservation. Natron salt is caustic. It burns living tissue on contact and can cause chemical burns even on dead skin. Keating's records describe bodies that were accidentally oversalted, their skin turning black and cracking like overcooked meat. The salt would sometimes react with body fluids to create a kind of organic acid that would eat through bone, leaving perfectly preserved skin wrapped around empty space where organs used to be. The smell during the natron treatment was reportedly so overwhelming that embalmers had to work in shifts, with each worker wearing cloths soaked in frankincense over their faces. The natron didn't just preserve. It actively dissolved anything it couldn't dehydrate, creating a soup of human dissolution that had to be carefully managed. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that some bodies showed signs of movement during the salting process. Muscle contractions caused by the chemical reactions would make corpses appear to twitch, sit up, or even reach out. These salt zombies were so feared that embalmers developed special restraints to keep bodies motionless during treatment. The psychological toll on embalmers was documented in medical papyri. Many developed what we would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, plagued by nightmares of the bodies they had processed. Some reported hallucinations of corpses following them home, or the sensation of natron salt burning their own skin during sleep. After 40 days in natron salt, Amenhotep's body has been transformed into something that's no longer quite human. The salt has drawn out every drop of moisture, leaving behind a form that's lighter than it was in life, but somehow more solid. The skin has become like leather, the muscles like wood, the bones like stone. And yet, According to Egyptian belief, this horror was necessary. Only through this complete transformation could the soul recognize and inhabit its earthly form in the afterlife. The mummification process wasn't just preservation. It was a resurrection technology that required destroying the human form to recreate it as something eternal. Let these ancient preservation techniques fade from your mind as we prepare to explore even darker secrets. But for now, let your breathing match the rhythm of the wind through ancient tombs, carrying you deeper into peaceful sleep. Deep beneath the Great Pyramid, in chambers never meant for living eyes, the most disturbing mummification rituals took place. These weren't the public ceremonies you've seen in documentaries. These were secret rites performed by a cult of death priests whose practices were so horrifying that they were erased from official records. In 1987, archaeologists discovered what they call the Forbidden Papyrus, a collection of texts that detail rituals so disturbing that the Egyptian government restricted access for over a decade. These documents reveal that the most important mummies underwent ceremonies that modern minds can barely comprehend. Let me tell you about the ritual of awakening the dead performed on Pharaoh Khufu's secret burial. According to the Forbidden Papyrus, Khufu's mummification included a ceremony where priests would periodically reanimate the corpse during preservation to ensure the soul remained properly attached. Using a combination of electrical storms and copper conductors built into the pyramid, the priests could send jolts of lightning through the mummy's body, causing muscle contractions that made the corpse appear to move. During these awakenings, priests would ask the pharaoh questions about the afterlife, recording his responses through the movement of his preserved lips. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence of soul-feeding rituals. The death priests believed that newly mummified bodies needed to consume spiritual energy from living humans to complete their transformation. Volunteers, usually elderly priests or convicted criminals, would undergo partial mummification while still alive. Their life force supposedly transferred to the royal mummies. These living donors would be wrapped in preservation bandages and left in chambers with the royal mummies for days at a time. Most died during the process, but their sacrifice was believed to strengthen the pharaoh's connection to immortality. Archaeological evidence suggests this practice continued in secret for over 800 years. Everyone knows about canopic jars, the containers that held the mummified organs. What they don't tell you is what else was preserved in those jars, and why opening them releases an odor so foul that archaeologists need special breathing equipment. The four sons of Horus, Imsidi, Duamutef, Hapi, and Kebesinuef, weren't just guardians of organs. According to newly translated texts, they were believed to be demons that fed on human organs, and the canopic jars were essentially feeding troughs designed to keep these creatures satisfied so they wouldn't consume the mummy's spiritual essence. Each organ wasn't simply preserved. It was prepared according to specific recipes that would appeal to its designated demon. The liver was mixed with honey and ground precious stones. The lungs were stuffed with aromatic herbs that supposedly made them irresistible to supernatural entities. The stomach was filled with fermented grain that would continue to produce alcohol for centuries. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The organs weren't alone in their jars. Archaeological analysis has revealed bone fragments from other humans mixed in with the preserved organs. These belonged to organ servants, people who were killed specifically to provide companionship for the deceased's organs in the afterlife. The preparation of these organ servants was documented in texts found in the tomb of Ramesses VII. Young children, usually between 8 and 12 years old, would be selected based on their physical resemblance to the deceased. They were then killed using methods that preserved their organs intact, usually drowning in specially prepared pools of natron solution. Their organs were then ground up and mixed with those of the deceased, creating a kind of spiritual soup that supposedly allowed the dead pharaoh to command an army of servants in the afterlife. The children's bones were carved into amulets and placed throughout the burial chamber to ensure their eternal servitude. The curse of the pharaohs isn't Hollywood fiction. It's a documented phenomenon with a body count that stretches from ancient times to the present day. But the real curse isn't supernatural. It's biological, psychological, and far more terrifying than any movie monster. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he unknowingly released spores of a fungus that had been sealed inside for over 3,000 years. This fungus, unique to mummification chambers, attacks the human respiratory system and can lie dormant for decades before activating. Over 40 people connected to the tomb's excavation died from mysterious respiratory illnesses over the following 30 years. But the biological curse is just the beginning. Embedded within mummy wrappings, archaeologists have found tiny capsules containing mercury, lead, and other toxic substances. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate defenses designed to poison anyone who disturbed the mummy's rest. The ancient Egyptians also employed psychological warfare that continues to this day. Hidden throughout burial chambers are what archaeologists call fear chambers. Rooms specifically designed to induce terror in tomb robbers. These contain carefully arranged displays of torture victims preserved in poses of extreme agony, with hieroglyphic warnings that describe the fates awaiting anyone who disturbs the dead. Modern researchers studying these fear chambers report unprecedented levels of psychological distress. The combination of toxic fumes, disturbing imagery, and acoustic effects created by the chamber's design can induce panic attacks, hallucinations, and long-term psychological trauma. Several archaeologists have required psychiatric treatment after extended exposure to these spaces. The most recent victim was Dr. Amanda Stevens, who spent 3 days cataloging artifacts in Khufu's hidden chamber in 2019. She emerged speaking ancient Egyptian, claiming to be receiving messages from the dead pharaoh. Medical examination revealed no physical cause for her condition, which continues to this day. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the mummy's curse is its apparent intelligence. Tomb robbers throughout history have reported that the curses seem to adapt, finding new ways to punish those who disturb the dead. Modern security systems malfunction in ways that seem almost intentional. Electronic equipment fails at crucial moments. People develop obsessions with ancient Egypt that destroy their lives and relationships. The curse isn't random. It's targeted, personal, and appears to understand exactly how to destroy each individual victim. Whether this is supernatural or simply the culmination of thousands of years of psychological conditioning, the effect is the same. The dead pharaohs continue to claim victims in the modern world. As these dark rituals fade from your consciousness, let your mind drift away from these ancient horrors. Rest assured that these practices died with their creators, their power reduced to mere historical curiosity. But the knowledge remains, preserved like the mummies themselves, waiting in the darkness of forgotten tombs. Beneath the Valley of the Kings lies a network of chambers that don't appear on any official archaeological map. These are the punishment tombs, burial sites specifically designed for those who betrayed the pharaohs, where death was just the beginning of an eternal nightmare. In 1995, ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalous spaces beneath KV-55, the mysterious tomb that may contain the remains of Akhenaten. When archaeologists finally gained access in 2003, they discovered something that challenged everything we thought we knew about Egyptian burial practices. The chamber contained over 200 mummies, but these weren't prepared for the afterlife. They were prepared for eternal punishment. Each body showed signs of deliberate mutilation before mummification. Hands severed and reattached backwards, heads twisted 180 degrees and locked in position with bronze wire. Bodies opened and filled with salt while the victims were still alive. Dr. Zahi Hawass, who led the initial exploration, described finding mummies whose faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror, their mouths open as if screaming. Chemical analysis revealed that many had been mummified using acid-based solutions rather than traditional natron, creating a preservation process that was essentially an eternity of chemical burning. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that some of these punishment mummies were still alive when they were sealed in their tombs. Scratch marks on the chamber walls, made by fingernails worn down to bone. Broken pottery jars that had contained water, rationed out to extend the suffering. Stone slabs pushed aside from the inside, showing desperate attempts to escape. The hieroglyphic inscriptions in these chambers don't describe honored dead preparing for the afterlife. Instead, they detail specific punishments designed to continue forever. Bodies positioned so they can see but never move. Hear but never speak. Hunger but never eat. The ancient Egyptians had turned mummification into the ultimate torture device. Recent excavations near Saqqara have uncovered what can only be described as an industrial mummification complex, a facility capable of processing hundreds of bodies simultaneously. This wasn't the careful, individual preservation we imagine, but a mass production system that reveals the horrifying scale of Egyptian death obsession. The complex, dating to the later periods of Egyptian civilization, contains over 30 embalming tables arranged in rows like a factory floor. Drainage systems channeled fluids from multiple bodies into central collection tanks. Overhead tracks allowed workers to move heavy corpses efficiently between stations. But this wasn't just about efficiency. It was about experimentation. Different areas of the complex were dedicated to testing new preservation techniques. Archaeologists found rooms containing hundreds of mummified animals that had been subjected to various chemical treatments. Their preserved corpses bearing tags that documented different experimental procedures. The most disturbing area was labeled in hieroglyphs as the learning chamber. Here, condemned criminals and slaves were apparently used as test subjects for new mummification techniques. The room contains stone tables with restraint systems and drainage channels, along with detailed records of how long different preservation methods took to kill the subjects. Evidence suggests that this facility operated for over 200 years, processing an estimated 50,000 bodies. But many of these weren't honored dead. They were victims of what can only be called an ancient Egyptian death cult that had perverted the sacred practice of mummification into something resembling a medieval torture chamber. The workers in this facility left behind their own records, carved into the walls in hieroglyphs and hieratic script. These texts reveal that many suffered from what we would recognize as severe mental illness, driven insane by their daily exposure to industrial-scale death and preservation. Perhaps the most shocking secret of Egyptian mummification is what happened to the mummies after they were supposedly at rest. From medieval times through the early 20th century, European society developed an addiction to consuming ground mummy powder, believing it had miraculous healing properties. This wasn't a small-scale folk remedy. It was an international industry that consumed thousands of ancient Egyptian mummies. Pharmaceutical companies in England, France, and Germany imported mummies by the shipload, grinding them into powder that was sold in apothecaries throughout Europe. The demand was so high that Egyptian dealers began manufacturing fake mummies, killing beggars and criminals, rapidly mummifying their bodies with tar and spices, then aging them in ovens to create artificial antiques. European buyers couldn't tell the difference and unknowingly consumed the remains of murder victims. But the real horror was in the medical applications. Mummy powder was prescribed for everything from headaches to epilepsy to tuberculosis. Wealthy Europeans would consume daily doses of ground human remains, believing that the preserved life force of ancient Egyptians would cure their ailments. The practice reached its peak during the plague years, when desperate Europeans consumed massive quantities of mummy powder in the belief that it would protect them from disease. Entire families would be found dead in their homes, surrounded by empty mummy powder containers, having essentially poisoned themselves with concentrated mercury and lead from the preservation process. Medical records from the period describe mummy madness, a condition where chronic consumers of mummy powder would develop obsessions with death and preservation. Victims would begin trying to mummify themselves while still alive, wrapping their bodies in bandages soaked with preservation chemicals. The practice didn't end until the early 1900s, when chemical analysis finally revealed that mummy powder contained dangerous levels of toxic substances. But by then, it's estimated that over 10,000 ancient Egyptian mummies had been consumed by Europeans, destroying priceless archaeological evidence and committing what amounts to mass grave robbing on an industrial scale. The last documented case of mummy consumption was in 1924, when a wealthy American industrialist died after taking a mummy elixir made from the ground remains of a priest of Thoth. His diary, discovered after his death, revealed that he had been consuming mummy powder daily for over 30 years, believing it was the secret to eternal youth. Modern analysis of his remains showed levels of mercury and lead so high that they should have killed him decades earlier. The preservation chemicals from the ancient mummies had somehow kept him alive long past his natural lifespan, creating a kind of living mummy that finally collapsed when the toxins reached critical levels. As we leave these disturbing revelations behind, let your mind drift away from these tales of consumption and obsession. Focus on the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the comfort of your modern world, safe from the dark appetites of our ancestors. Modern technology has allowed us to peer inside ancient mummies without unwrapping them, and what we've discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about Egyptian preservation practices. CT scans and MRI imaging have revealed horrors that archaeologists of previous generations never suspected. The mummy of Ramesses III, housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, appeared to be a standard royal mummification until 2012, when CT scanning revealed that his throat had been slit from ear to ear during the preservation process. The cut was so precise that it severed his windpipe, esophagus, and both carotid arteries, injuries that would have caused rapid death if he had been alive. But here's what makes this terrifying. The cutting was done after partial mummification had begun. His skin already showed signs of natron treatment when the throat wound was inflicted. This suggests that Ramesses III was either killed during his own mummification, or that the embalmers continued working on a body that had been brutally murdered. DNA analysis of tissue found in the throat wound revealed genetic material from at least 3 different individuals, none of them related to Ramesses. Someone had deliberately contaminated the pharaoh's mummy with foreign biological material, possibly as part of a curse or revenge ritual. Even more disturbing is the mummy known as the Screaming Woman, discovered in 1881, but not properly analyzed until modern scanning technology became available. 3D imaging revealed that her mouth wasn't naturally open. Her jaw had been deliberately dislocated and wedged open with small stones, then held in position during mummification. The stones weren't random. They were carved with hieroglyphs that translate to, "May your voice be heard in the land of the dead." This woman had been prepared specifically to scream for eternity, her voice supposedly carrying messages from the living to the underworld. Genetic analysis of Egyptian mummies has revealed family relationships so disturbing that they challenge our understanding of ancient Egyptian society. Brother-sister marriages weren't just royal traditions. They were part of a systematic breeding program designed to create humans with specific genetic traits that supposedly made them better suited for mummification. The royal mummies of the 18th dynasty show evidence of deliberate genetic manipulation spanning over 200 years. Inbreeding was so extreme that many pharaohs suffered from genetic disorders that would have made their lives constant agony. But these disorders also created physiological changes that made their bodies more receptive to preservation chemicals. King Tutankhamun's DNA reveals that he was the product of generations of deliberate genetic manipulation. His parents were brother and sister, and their parents were also siblings. This wasn't accident or tradition. It was intentional breeding designed to create what ancient texts call the pure blood of eternity. Dr. Karsten Pusch's 2010 genetic study revealed that royal Egyptian families deliberately bred for specific traits that would enhance mummification success. Reduced melanin production made skin more receptive to preservation chemicals. Modified bone density allowed for better structural integrity during the drying process. Even blood chemistry was altered to reduce bacterial growth after death. But the cost was horrifying. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple genetic disorders, including a cleft palate, club foot, and a spine curvature so severe that he required walking aids. CT scans show that he lived in constant pain from malformed joints and compressed organs. He was essentially bred to be a perfect mummy at the expense of any quality of life. The genetic data also revealed evidence of mummy compatibility testing, a practice where potential marriage partners were evaluated based on how well their genetic combination would preserve after death. Marriages were arranged not for political alliances or love, but for optimal post-mortem preservation potential. Even more disturbing is evidence that this genetic manipulation continued beyond the royal family. Analysis of noble mummies shows similar patterns of selective breeding, suggesting that entire social classes were being genetically modified to create better mummies. The ancient Egyptians were essentially practicing eugenics in service of death. The final horror revealed by DNA analysis is that many mummies contain genetic material from multiple individuals, not contamination from handling, but deliberate mixing of blood and tissue from different people during preservation. Some mummies are essentially biological composites, created by combining parts from multiple corpses to create improved versions of the deceased. The black market in Egyptian mummies continues to this day, with modern technology making the trade more sophisticated and more deadly than ever before. International mummy trafficking networks use CT scanning equipment to evaluate mummies before purchase, seeking specific types that command premium prices from private collectors. In 2019, Egyptian authorities intercepted a shipment of 47 mummies being smuggled to private buyers in Europe and America. These weren't ancient artifacts discovered by archaeologists. They were newly created mummies, made using traditional techniques on modern victims. The smugglers had essentially recreated ancient Egyptian preservation methods to manufacture fake antiquities. The victims were identified as missing persons from rural Egyptian villages, people whose disappearances had gone unreported. The modern mummy makers had perfected techniques that could age new mummies to appear thousands of years old, using chemical treatments that mimicked the effects of time. But the most chilling discovery was that some of these modern mummies had been created using living subjects. Medical examination revealed that at least 12 of the intercepted mummies had been preserved while still alive, using updated versions of ancient techniques that extended the dying process over weeks to ensure better preservation. The investigation revealed an international network of mummy collectors who specifically sought out living mummies, people who had been preserved while conscious. These collectors paid premium prices for mummies that showed signs of awareness during preservation, believing that the suffering enhanced the spiritual power of the artifacts. As we prepare to leave these modern horrors behind, remember that the ancient Egyptian obsession with death and preservation continues to influence our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. But for now, let these disturbing truths fade away as we prepare for our final journey into the lasting legacy of mummification. As our journey through the horrifying secrets of Egyptian mummification comes to an end, we must confront one final, disturbing truth. The curse of the pharaohs isn't supernatural. It's far worse. It's a combination of ancient biological warfare, psychological manipulation, and modern greed that continues to claim victims today. Every mummy carries within its wrappings a cocktail of bacteria, fungi, and chemical preservatives that have been evolving for thousands of years. These organisms have had millennia to adapt and mutate in the unique environment of mummified tissue. When disturbed, they release spores that can cause respiratory infections, skin conditions, and neurological symptoms that medical science is only beginning to understand. But the psychological component is equally powerful. The knowledge that you've disturbed something that was meant to rest for eternity creates a form of psychological conditioning that can manifest as physical symptoms. The human mind, knowing it has violated something sacred, begins to expect punishment, and often creates that punishment through psychosomatic illness. The ancient Egyptians understood this psychological warfare better than we give them credit for. They deliberately designed their preservation methods to create maximum psychological impact on anyone who would disturb the dead. Every element of mummification, from the horrifying tools to the disturbing imagery to the toxic preservation chemicals, was calculated to inspire fear in tomb robbers. And perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that our modern fascination with mummies perpetuates the very obsession that created these horrors in the first place. Every museum display, every documentary, every Halloween costume continues the ancient Egyptian belief that death is something to be conquered, controlled, and preserved rather than accepted. The mummies of ancient Egypt represent humanity's most extreme attempt to deny the reality of mortality. In trying to preserve their bodies forever, the ancient Egyptians created something that was neither fully alive nor properly dead, a liminal state that continues to disturb our collective unconscious thousands of years later. But now, as our exploration of these ancient horrors comes to an end, let your mind release these dark secrets. Let the knowledge of what humans are capable of in their fear of death fade away like desert sand. Focus instead on the peace of acceptance, the comfort of natural cycles, the beauty of mortality that makes life precious. Rest now, knowing that these ancient practices belong to the past, their power diminished by understanding and time. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be free from the whispers of the dead. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through the secrets of Egyptian mummification. If these ancient mysteries have brought you peace and perspective on the cycles of life and death, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe for more explorations into history's hidden truths. Next week, we'll discover the brutal reality of life in ancient Rome, where gladiators faced death not just in the arena, but in training schools that were essentially human slaughterhouses. But for now, rest peacefully, under the same stars that witnessed these ancient practices, knowing that understanding the darkness of our past helps us appreciate the light of our present. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, through time.